An 18-year-old student who identified as an East Asian supremacist has been detained under the Internal Security Act. He is the third person to be dealt with under the ISA who was radicalized by violent far-right extremist ideologies. Geraldine Yap with more.
This image, known as a sonnenrad or a sunwheel, is a symbol often associated with far-right extremism. It's what 18-year-old Nick Lee tattooed on his right elbow to showcase his allegiance to the movement. The ISD says there are no indications his tattoo artist knew what the image was, and no action will be taken against the artist. The student's path to self-radicalization began when he came across Islamophobic and far-right extremist content on social media in early 2023. Now, he didn't just consume content that was recommended to him by online algorithms. He also searched for and repeatedly watched more of such content, including the live-streamed video footage of a terror attack on a mosque in Christchurch, New Zealand in 2019. The Internal Security Department says Lee, who is of Chinese ethnicity, had developed a strong hatred towards Malays and Muslims as well as other ethnicities by early 2024. They include Jews, Mexicans, African Americans and Indians. He believed killing them was justified. Lee also believed in the superiority of Chinese, Korean and Japanese ethnicities and supported white supremacy. In another showcase of allegiance, he customized T-shirts with logos used by neo-Nazis, white supremacists and other far-right groups. The ISD says Lee had aspired to carry out attacks in Singapore. This includes replicating the Christchurch attack, although he had not identified any specific mosque to target, and throwing Molotov cocktails at Malay Muslim neighbours during a religious holiday. Lee believed violent action was needed to prevent the Chinese majority in Singapore from being replaced by what he saw as a rapidly growing Malay population. He had no timeline to carry out attacks, and investigations did not find any imminent threat to Singapore. The ISD says those around Lee were unaware of his radicalization, and there is no indication that he tried to influence them. Lee is the third youth radicalized by far-right ideologies to be dealt with under the ISA.
We're seeing surges around the world of far-right ideology, certainly sometimes in response to major global events. These are then sometimes framed by far-right groups in terms of trying to fuel recruitment, radicalization, putting forth and tailoring their appeal to youth. And as a result, we have seen an increase in terms of how far-right ideology tends to appeal to youth simply because of their ability to leverage on social media, espouse and expound on conspiracy theories, and sometimes use aesthetics that are very appealing to the youth.
Two other self-radicalized individuals have also been dealt with. 56-year-old Singaporean Hamiza Hamza was issued a restriction order after she was radicalized amid the ongoing Israel-Hamas conflict. Meanwhile, Malaysian Saharuddin Sari was arrested and repatriated in November 2024. The ISD had worked closely with its Malaysian counterpart to investigate the 34-year-old, who was a supporter of Islamist militant and terrorist organizations.
All three cases of self-radicalization by far-right extremist ideologies in Singapore have involved teenagers so far. Now, the ISD says youths may be more susceptible to such ideologies and gravitate towards a sense of belonging and identity that far-right movements appear to provide. The first case involved a 16-year-old detained in December 2020. He had made detailed plans and preparations to conduct attacks, using a machete against Muslims at two mosques near his home. Now, the youth was influenced by the 2019 Christchurch mosque attack. He was released in January 2024 after ISD assessed that he had made good progress in his rehabilitation. The second case involved another 16-year-old who identified as a white supremacist. He was exposed to violent extremist material and developed a hatred of communities such as African Americans and Arabs. The youth had hoped to be recruited by overseas groups for attacks and wanted to conduct a mass shooting in the US in 10 years' time. He was issued with a restraining order in 2023. And for more analysis, we are joined by Dr. Shashi Jayakumar, Executive Director of SJK Geostrategic Advisory. Dr. Jayakumar, thank you so much for joining us this evening. This is the third Singaporean youth with far-right extremist ideologies to be dealt with under the ISA. What do you make of the rise in far-right extremism here in Singapore?
I think it's potentially very serious, and we should take these kinds of individuals very seriously. As your analysis has pointed out, this is not the first case. This is the third case to be dealt with by ISA orders. And if you take the cases in totality, it's not a surprise to me that of all the far-right cases that we know that have occurred in Southeast Asia, they've come first to Singapore, which is by far the most diverse and also the most wired nation in Southeast Asia. So I think looking back at radicalization and extremism in Singapore, we shouldn't simply dismiss this as just a bunch of pro-ISIS individuals or further back the JI. There are new forms of creeping, insidious, extremist forms of thinking which are coming into, well, as I said, the most wired country in Southeast Asia. And some of these individuals, if they got through the aspirational phase, would have created a serious rent in the body politic, in social cohesion, and in the tolerant nation that we call home. And as our security officials or policymakers has repeatedly said, it's not a matter of if, but when one of these actually gets through. So it's something quite serious that we have to think about, and we shouldn't dismiss far-right ideologies or being willing to fight for white people as just a joke or something to be made light of.
So it's not a matter of if, but when, and this is the third case under the ISA, Dr. Jayakumar. But how much of a cause of concern is it here in Singapore at this point?
I think it's a real concern. And if you look at the pretty detailed ISD statement which has come out on this, I think they also take this very seriously. And if you look, I don't mean to be alarmist, of course, but if you look at the ISD threat assessment reports, which are issued from time to time, almost once a year now, I think for some considerable amount of time now in these reports, far-right ideology has been singled out almost as co-equal with the pro-ISIS types, which are still coming in at a trickle. And in a way, for those of us who map and track what's happening further out in the West, in Europe, in North America, for some considerable amount of time, security officials there have also been saying, look, far-right is at least co-equal, or in some particular nations, more of a threat than the pro-ISIS types. So it's a matter of looking at what we can do about it. And of course, the security services here have done a great job at interdicting, presumably tracking some of these individuals. But it's not just about issuing ISA orders or detaining people. Unfortunately, from time to time, yes, that may be needed. But what is hinted at in the ISD press statements and in some of what our policymakers are saying is you need to go upstream to tackle the problem. Arresting people is part of the issue. We're going upstream as in social media hygiene, cyber literacy, critical thinking, which is now, I'm glad to say, being tried in schools, other kinds of early interventions like that. Are, I suspect, going to be very, very important in time to come, because there's no accident that the far-right cases in Singapore were young or youth cases. So if you make early interventions, you can presumably prevent others from going down that radicalized trajectory.
Is there a trend in particular that you're observing is happening with the type, speed, mode, basically the nature of far-right extremism being spread?
I think it's very clear, and Minister Shanmugam, our Law and Home Affairs Minister, and others have said this. In the age of social media, not so much just Facebook, but other platforms as well, in the age of gamification, because I noticed gamification played a role in this individual's trajectory, the timeline to radicalization has noticeably quickened. If you go far back to the 9/11 period and just after, when you had the JI, the Jamaat Islamiyah, it's quite different, really. It's radicalized through face-to-face circles, preaching circles, charismatic groups. You made to feel part of an exclusivist circle. That theme is still kind of there, but the timeline to become part of the select group, you feel like the chosen one. You feel you're doing something very, very important, and you feel this sharpening of exclusivist identities, meaning you otherize people, other people who don't feel like you are fit to be eliminated, they're the enemy. All that has been accelerated clearly by social media and by this impact of gamification. The timeline of radicalization statistically is much shorter, and the ages of the individuals concerned in Singapore are getting younger. But in a way, that's no surprise, because if you look at exactly the same sorts of trends which are happening in the West, in Europe and North America, it tracks that very, very closely. So my personal conviction really is what you see elsewhere in other parts of the world will inevitably come to Southeast Asia. And I suspect they will come to Singapore first, namely because we are so wired and so diverse.
Very quickly, if you could, Dr. Jayakumar, the teen in this case was supportive of white supremacy ideologies. Why might such extreme ideologies appeal to Singaporean youths? Dr. Jayakumar, okay, I'm afraid we have lost him there. An issue with our connection with Dr. Jayakumar. That was Dr. Shashi Jayakumar, Executive Director of SJK Geostrategic Advisory.